Army Men Green Rogue on PlayStation is one of the few instances of a cross-generational game release where the past-gen version is actually better than the current-gen version. That's not to say that the PS1 Green Rogue looks better than the PS2 Green Rogue. It absolutely, objectively does not. But as far as fun goes, yeah, I think I'd rank the PS1 game above the PS2 game. They have the same story, which is why I was originally going to cover them both in the same review, but after playing the first couple of levels on the PS1 version for comparison, I quickly realized that the gameplay in the levels, while sharing the same rough settings, alpine, jungle, city, etc., the levels are completely different between the two games. 3DO went for a more run-and-gun style game here, as opposed to the standard third-person shooter that most of the series provides. And while they probably nailed that goal better in the PS2 version, since it automatically moves you forward, the PS1 game is just more fun. It's still got a real run-and-gun feel, but it doesn't scroll forward automatically, so it gives you a little bit more feeling of control. You can't go backwards in the level, so it's definitely not just regular army men but in a tunnel, but you aren't forced forward before you're ready either, which makes it easier to ensure that your genocide of the tan fascists is complete, and you're not leaving anyone left alive. It's also just not nearly as difficult. The final boss of the game is like the Mount Everest of difficulty spikes, and is downright unreasonably difficult. But the first 98% of the game is pretty fair and much less brutal than the PS2 version, in my opinion. A challenging game is good, but a brutal game is frustrating. On PS2, Green Rogue is the latter. On PS1, it's a pretty solid example of the former. The premise of the game is that the Green Army has completed a secret project to create the Omega Soldier, the ultimate super soldier, by extracting plastic from Sergeant Hawk and each of his Bravo Company commandos, and mixing them together in a mold to create a soldier with the strengths of each of them, which, I'm not gonna lie, that's a pretty cool concept. And that's where the European game gets its name. Instead of being called Green Rogue in Europe, this is called Army Men Omega Soldier. Unfortunately, while it's a cool concept, that concept is ruined by pretty bad gameplay and a complete lack of any character development. You awaken in the jungle in the wreckage of a green helicopter that was shot down while transporting you. You start walking and decide to murder everything you see because everything is trying to murder you. In the PS2 version, you fight blue and gray soldiers in addition to tan soldiers, although the game never explains why the blue and gray are allied with the tan. In this PS1 version, though, you're only fighting the tan, with no blue or gray troops appearing at all. Aiming feels a bit weird, but it's not nearly as hard to aim as it is on PS2. By and large, it feels a lot like aiming in any of the other PS1 Army Men games, in that it's cumbersome and clunky, but not unusable. Graphics are about what you'd expect from a PS1 Army Men game, much inferior to Metal Gear Solid, but better than something like Return Fire on 3DO. The sound is fine. Music's definitely solid, but the sound effects are unfortunately so forgettable that the good music kinda gets dragged down. You mostly get the same weapons as on PS2. You get the rifle, the flamethrower, and the rocket launcher, but instead of a grenade launcher, you get regular grenades that you throw like in the other games. You also don't have to pick which weapon you want to carry. You get all of them once you pick them up, and you can freely switch between them. Each weapon can be upgraded to level 3 by picking up a duplicate, and each time you die, you lose a level. If you have a weapon at level 1 and you die, you lose that weapon entirely, except for the rifle. You will always have at least the level 1 rifle. Honestly, I think that's a pretty decent way to balance it. It was pure frustration to get a weapon maxed out on the PS2 version, only to lose it in favor of a crappy level 1 weapon because you weren't able to get out of the way of the power-up. All in all, Army Men Green Rogue on PlayStation, while it's better than the game's PlayStation 2 version, is awful, and is definitely the third worst game in the series, after Green Rogue on PS2 and Portal Runner on Game Boy Color, respectively. No game will ever dethrone Green Rogue on PS2 as the worst in the series, but Green Rogue on PS1 definitely gives it a solid run for its money. This one is at least worth playing, in my opinion, if you're a big fan of the Army Men series, but only once, not necessarily all the way through to the end, and it's absolutely not worth buying, unless you are just bound and determined to have a full Army Men collection on yourself. If you are not a staunch fan of the series, just steer clear of this one. My rating for Army Men Green Rogue on PlayStation is an F.